Gladiator treatment was absolutely heinous, and today we're gonna see how much detail I can get into without getting in trouble with the internet rules. We've got all the different ways to kill a gladiator, hunting games, how to make sure your dead body is really dead, and more. What do you think would have been the worst part of being a gladiator? Let me know in the comments and let's see if you're right. So most of the deaths in the Colosseum were public executions, which were sort of a halftime show. Now during the 4.5 centuries that the Colosseum was in use, the program of games and shows didn't really change. They had a set schedule. The amphitheater, as it was called by ancient Romans, hosted a lineup that lasted for many hours as spectators were entertained by a variety of performances. So not only did the program include morning fights between different pairs of animals, and then you've got the hunting games, known as venaciones. Now you've got lunchtime around noon, and that's when people could watch the executions of those who had committed serious crimes. And in the afternoon you've got the beloved gladiator fights. But hey, let's talk about those gladiator executions. So Roman executions of those sentenced to death were staged publicly as a deterrent, so that everybody, including youngsters whose presence in the Colosseum was encouraged, could see the consequences of committing serious crimes. So when it comes to gladiators, they're gonna fight, and usually it's gonna cost at least one of them their lives. Now if one were clearly defeated, you could raise a hand and that would be a sign that you'd be like, hey, mercy, please. But that's not up to you. That's up to the emperor, saying like, you can live. Nope, you can't live. So when gladiators were sentenced to death, sometimes it was at the hands of animals. Also, animal harm was kind of a regular thing as well. Animal hunts were typically the opening event at the games, and it wasn't unusual for scores of unfortunate creatures to be wiped out in a single exhibition. 9,000 animals were killed during a 100-day ceremony to mark the opening of the Colosseum, and another 11,000 were later killed as part of a 123-day festival held by the Emperor Trajan in the 2nd century AD. Now while most animals were merely ended for sport, others were trained to do tricks or even pitted against one another in fights. In the movies you only really see lions and tigers, but the truth is that like on top of the big cats, ancient Romans killed entire menageries of animals. From the historical records that we know, there were also rhinos, hippos, crocodiles, giraffes, elephants, gazelles, antelopes, jackals, ostriches, hyenas, cheetahs, panthers, bears, and leopards, as well as donkeys, camels, horses, rabbits, deer, boars, wolves, and many more. So where did the Romans find all these animals? Well, the crocodiles, the rhinos, the hippos, and the giraffes came from southern Egypt. Gazelles, antelopes, jackals, ostriches, hyenas, lions, cheetahs, panthers, and elephants came from North Africa. The bears were mostly from the Atlas Mountains in Morocco. Italy and other European countries provided all the herbivores, such as hares, deer, wild pigs, donkeys, and then you've also got some others. But I don't want to list everything. Out of all the ways to die, being drawn and quartered was probably the worst. Now the people who deserved such an end were not meant to be seen as human, and the pain, humiliation, and brutality was intended to create a distinct separation between the audience and the condemned. The message was that the normal men would not suffer multiple deaths. So how the heck do I explain what quartering is without getting in incredible amounts of trouble? Hold on to your heads, folks. So remember biology class in high school? Having to dissect a frog or a starfish or whatever? Okay, well picture doing that to an alive or a dead human. And yeah, just as messily and clumsily as you would have back in your first attempt. Oh, I can still smell it. Now, finally, this unfortunate victim would be quartered. So sometimes this was achieved by tying each limb to a different horse, which were then startled into running in different directions so as to rip the body apart. Look, nobody cared about horse welfare back then. And it showed. Something very important in gladiator fights was making sure fluid was shed. Specifically, the red fluid that tends to run through folks' veins. There's a number of reasons why, and I'll touch on one of those uses for gladiator fluid later for sure. But the earliest instance of red shed being associated with public gladiator exhibition was likely borrowed from the ancient Etruscans. They considered the shedding of scarlet elixir as an essential part of important funerary processions, honoring the deceased and the gods by shedding the fluid of enemy captives. A rather horrifying looking divinity with a hammer also would just be like waiting for you after you die. Which like, I guess that's a way to honor death. So if you thought being drawn and quartered was a brutal way to go, would you prefer being burned alive? Because I'm personally just on team whatever gets the job done faster. I'd say losing my head would be the best, but after learning how long that could take, that might have almost been worse. So let me know in the comments what you think would be ideal. Nevertheless, those sentenced to death by cremation and did not have a pleasant time. The convicts sentenced to be burned alive were made to wear beautifully decorated clothes, soaked with flammable substances, and then made to dance as their clothes were ignited. Now the resulting dances weren't pleasant at all for the convicts. Once again, just adding on to the idea of human turmoil for the entertainment of nobles. Hey folks, they had to do something for fun back then. Video games and silly little treats weren't a concept yet. So if you chose off with your head as the best way to go, this next segment is for you. Unless you're Marie Antoinette reincarnated, and then I apologize profusely. Sentences ad gladium can result in beheadings, but also in one-sided fights with a foregone conclusion. So often, two sentenced people were pushed into the arena together. One carried a large weapon that was very sharp and pointy, and the other was unarmed. The unarmed human would have to run all around the arena, arena, while the one holding the weapon had to catch and kill you. Now, when this occurred, the winner remained in the arena, handed the weapon to a new prisoner, and the hideous game would start all over again. The last one standing was normally finished off by a hunter. Like, I know this is a redundant statement at this point, but it's cruel to give folks hope that they'll survive, make them fight for their lives, and not have it be worth it in the end. Whew, that's a haunting sentence no matter what the context. Okay, moving on before I get sad. Okay, ready to hear about more awful ways to die? Sentences ad bestias involved criminals being eaten alive by wild and ferocious beasts. Yeah, I know I already hinted at this earlier, but I felt like it needed to be elaborated on. This vile punishment was most frequently inflicted on those whose social background was kinda low. So when it came to the show's programming, killings done by animals had to meet specific requirements. Convicts were not supposed to take too long to die to avoid slowing down the planned schedule, although they were not to die too quickly, because this would also mean an unsatisfactory experience for the audience. So the two most common ways to stage the damnatio ad bestias were to tie the nude criminal to a pole and leave him for animals, or to let him or her run around the arena being chased by the wild beast. The final result didn't change, but the audience preferred the latter because it was more spectacular. No matter what, you weren't getting out of the spectacle alive, and I mean that for the man and the animal. But of course, it had to be entertaining to the crowds. You can see where the Hunger Games got their inspiration. Okay, so this next way of being killed. Not really sure if I can say this anymore, so I'm only going to call it by its name once. Listen close. Crucifixion was also common and was a punishment much more ancient than the Romans. Other than that, we're going to call it the way Jesus died, in case I refer to this again, for safety. So this method of killing can result in an agonizing and terrible death by smothering, because the thorax was compressed by asphyxiation, by a loss of scarlet elixir, or by cardiovascular collapse through pain. So because the agony might last for, several hours, and the program could not be delayed, to accelerate the process of death of the criminal, the legs of the convicts were broken. Alternately, leopards, tigers, or lions were released to maul the wretched victim. Undoubtedly, this was, I think, the cruelest sentence in the arena of the Colosseum. Okay, well, I guess depending on who you ask. So, how do you make sure one of the gruesomely awful ways I mentioned before actually kills somebody? So at the end of the execution segment of your program, an attendant dressed as the ferryman of the souls across the Styx, the river of hell, would enter the arena to remove the corpses. This character was also based on that of Charon, the Etruscan god of death, who always entered the stage together with a representation of the god Mercury, who accompanied the souls. Now, what Mercury actually did at the Colosseum was to pierce the tip of a large red-hot spear into the flesh of the victims to make sure they were actually dead. If they were, then you would bop the victims with a hammer, thus symbolically taking possession of them, and after this, macabre ritual, regular attendants cleaned up the area of all the corpses. Everything had to be ready so the next show could begin. Kill, clean, repeat. Kill, clean, repeat. So this last thing for today isn't exactly a punishment in the regular sense of the word, so bear with me. Gladiators were really exploited, and when you're objectified to the point they were, I consider that a punishment in itself. So one of the most bizarre and unusual beauty trends of the time for most women was the phenomenon of using gladiator sweat for facials. Now these facials were believed to improve complexion and maintain youthfulness, since the sweat of successful gladiators was considered a aphrodisiac. The more successful a gladiator was in the arena, the more potent their bodily fluids were believed to be, and this sweat was collected from their bodies using a tool called a strigil. Now this was used for the scraping of dirt, sweat, and oil across both ancient Greek and Roman cultures. And then sometimes you'd mix it with olive oil to give it a more desirable consistency. And then you sell it as a facial cream to the women of Rome. Now the facial of gladiator sweat was just one of the many beauty trends that made use of their bodily fluids. Gladiator redness was another hot commodity, sold once again as an aphrodisiac. Some historians even report that the redness of wounded or killed gladiators would be mixed with wine and then consumed by many. So I don't know. I think that kind of exploitation is just not great. And that's the end of things once again, folks. I've been Alexa, your resident emo girly. See y'all next time I buzz in over here at Bumblebee.